This is the fourth and final episode of our series on sports betting. If you missed any of the first 3 episodes, take a listen and get up to date.
5 years after the U.S. Supreme Court's decision opened the door for states to allow sports betting, Governor Roy Cooper signed the bill legalizing mobile sports betting in North Carolina on June 14th, 2023, at Spectrum Center in Charlotte.
I also want to say that the North Carolina Lottery Commission is hard at work now, beginning the process of implementation of this legislation. It is a mammoth job, but they are working very hard and look forward to additional help from everybody to make sure that this works. This is truly a bipartisan accomplishment, one of many over the last few years, and this certainly will help North Carolina compete, and that is critical.
I'm Brian Murphy from WRAL News.
And I'm Tim Donnelly from 99.9 The Fan, and this is episode 4 of a brief history of Triangle Sports on legal sports gambling in North Carolina. In this episode, with the legislative fights over, the work of turning sports betting into reality falls on the Lottery Commission. Plus, what's actually in the bill, who benefits, and what are the worries moving forward.
House Bill 347, which became law with Cooper's signature at a celebratory signing event in Charlotte, spelled out how widespread mobile and select additional in-person sports betting would proceed in the state. It also gave a lot of authority to the North Carolina Lottery Commission to implement rules and regulations around sports betting. This was new authority for the Lottery Commission, which would need to hire staff to deal with sports betting. Other states have used their lottery commissions to run betting too.
And lawmakers weren't quite done tweaking the new state law. The 2019 agreement struck between teams, leagues, and operators had held together through passage of the bill. But the teams that called North Carolina home and the leagues like NASCAR and the PGA Tour that bring annual events to the state always had a bit of an edge in pushing for changes. And late in 2023, months after Cooper signed the state law, the teams and leagues got a critical change put into the bill through the state budget. In order for operators, and those are the companies like FanDuel, DraftKings, BetMGM, Caesars, and so on, to get a license from the Lottery Commission, they'd have to sign an agreement with a team, league, or North Carolina facility, such as Charlotte Motor Speedway or a PGA Tour event hosting golf course.
I'm Carrie Boyce, chair of the Sports Betting Committee of the North Carolina State Lottery Commission. All operator applicants must include a written designation agreement. And this is a unique feature of North Carolina's law that operators must have an agreement with a place of public accommodation. Those are private agreements between sports teams, leagues, and venues.
Brian, we need to break this all down, translate this a little bit. So, for example, we know that Fanatics is the Carolina Hurricanes partner. What does that mean for the two entities?
When you get to PNC, you'll see signage everywhere for Fanatics. It also means that that's their only way to get an operator license was to partner with the Carolina Hurricanes. That doesn't mean, however, that it's the only operator you can use while you're at PNC. You can still bet on whatever app you want when you're at PNC. All the operators have statewide coverage. Each team and venue just has a specific partner that will be featured.
So looking at this from the customer, the bettor's perspective, not much different based on where I am?
Right. It was a clear win for the teams and the facilities. They controlled who had access to the state. For gamblers, however, it won't make much difference in who you can place bets with or how you can place your bets. And to date, this has been the last major change in the law.
Governor Roy Cooper is maybe the state's most famous Hurricanes fan.
A kid who grew up in eastern North Carolina knowing zero about hockey and never having played and never really skated much. Now I can yell at the team to not pinch and to make sure that they're covering the crease and all of that. You know, I could tell them exactly what to do, just like the average Joe fan. And the rare times I get to sit on the ice, even pound the glass a little bit. I'm a huge Hurricanes fan. I had season tickets for years. Becoming governor, I've not been able to go as much, but I watch them on iPads riding in cars late at night and watching replays and that kind of thing. But it's a fun sport, and what I would really love, my last year as governor, we could win the Stanley Cup, because I'd be lobbying Tom Dundon and Don Waddell and Gary Bettman for the cup in the governor's mansion for a day. I'd pour a little Diet Sundrop in it. We'd have a great time here if that happens. So just keep my fingers crossed.
The addition of sports betting, Cooper said, would help the Hurricanes and North Carolina's other professional teams.
I love sports in and of itself. And a lot of people don't like pro sports because they just think, money's about. Yeah, it's about money. Unfortunately, college sports are about money now too. But I think the way I look at it is jobs, better jobs for everyday people. So I think this is going to be an infusion of funds for these teams that will spur economic investment. It's going to cause more people to want to come here. When people are thinking about expanding their business or citing their business, they look at quality of life. That's a big thing. And sports, just as symphony, the arts, theater, which I also advocate for a lot and talk about it in terms of economic development, I think sports is a real economic driver. Major League Baseball would be fantastic for North Carolina if we could get it here. So I think this is going to be an infusion of funding for these teams to help improve and contract with more small businesses to provide supplies and whatever they do. This is going to be good for our state overall.
The new law allows for 11 operators like FanDuel and DraftKings in the state with agreements with pro teams, facilities, or NASCAR and the PGA Tour. In addition, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians and the Catawba Nation, which have casinos with in-person sportsbooks on their tribal land, can have agreements with operators too. There are more than 13 operators who want in, but capping it at 13 serves to limit the number of operators in the state.
And there was a little bit of forethought. As you said, if the state ever got a Major League Baseball team, the law would not have to be changed to allow that team to sign a deal with another operator. Also, the pro teams or facilities can host in-person sportsbooks under the law. Betting on horse races is also allowed under a separate provision. But the process would take a while. Here's Commissioner Carrie Boyce again.
We want to get a fair and responsible program up and running as soon as possible and well before the June 15th deadline. We also want to make sure we get as much right up front as possible and learn lessons from other states that have gone through this experience.
The Commission and the lottery's Deputy Executive Director for Gaming Compliance and Sports Gaming, Sterl Carpenter, announced in mid-November that it would not be ready for January 8th, the first date allowed under the law.
Anyone itching to place a legal sports bet in North Carolina will keep itching because it's gonna last a little bit longer. You're gonna have to wait. WRAL's Brian Murphy explains why North Carolina's Lottery Commission, they're not quite set. They need a little bit more time to get ready, apparently.
Yeah, the first day that sports betting could be allowed in the state is January 8th, but the North Carolina Lottery Commission says there's simply too much work to do to start on that date. The commission has until June 15th for sports betting to start. Commissioners did not give a start date, but they say they got a lot of work before they can license operators.
Were you surprised by that at all?
I wasn't. There is a lot of work to do. Operators haven't even been able to apply yet, and they need to vet all 12 of them before they can start.
There are some things being laid in place, though, right? Like you can't legally bet, but you have an idea of what we will be able to bet on.
Yeah, one of the things that came out today is we got an initial list of the sports that North Carolinians will eventually be able to place a wager on. All the usual suspects are there, but so is the annual Nathan's Hot Dog Eating Contest and other competitive eating events. Netball, which is a popular game in Australia and New Zealand, sort of like basketball without dribbling. Pasapalo, the national game of Finland, a baseball-like game without a pitcher, and floorball, a version of floor hockey. Not sure if operators will offer bets on all these games, but they're allowed to.
These are things I've never even heard of yet. We'll be able to place bets. We'll see how it continues to grow and change.
The next target for many was the February 8th Super Bowl, but that was too fast for the commission. Given the state's love affair with college basketball, March Madness always seemed like the most likely start time, and in late January, the commission made its decision.
Now on to our other breaking news story of the hour. Sports fans will now legally be able to place mobile bets in North Carolina just in time for March Madness. A short time ago, the NC Lottery Commission announced gambling on your phone will start March 11th.
On a pound-for-pound basis, we expect that North Carolina is going to be one of the better states for sure. I mean, there's fervent sports fan interest. The population of fans for the different colleges down there should make that a big, source of excitement. The fact that the state's launching on the week before March Madness is obviously an indication that everybody knows that North Carolina is a huge college basketball state. We expect this should be a really big state. Everybody's excited. And, frankly, it's the only significant state going live this year. So there's an accentuated focus from operators on making sure that North Carolina is treated well and developed to its fullest.
That's BetMGM CFO Gary Deutsch. BetMGM is one of the sports betting operators active at the launch of sports betting in North Carolina.
All right, so that covers mobile sports betting. But what about in-person sports books? There's a lot more to work out. We'll be right back.
The in-person sports books and horse race betting authorized by the law will take a bit longer to be implemented. But once mobile sports betting began with 8 licensed operators on March 11th, the state started collecting revenue. The law calls for an 18% tax on the gross wagering revenue from operators. That's far lower than New York, which is at 51%, but close to many other states' tax rates. Gross revenue is defined as the total amount received by the operator from sports wagers, less the amount paid as winnings before any deductions for expenses, fees, or taxes. Early versions of the legislation had a tax rate of 8% and allowed for gambling operators to claim large deductions for the money they spent on promotions used to attract new customers. Here's Governor Cooper.
We insisted on and wanted to make sure that the state got its fair share here. If we're going to go to trouble to do it, that we needed to make sure that that's the case. We also wanted to make sure that there were appropriate safeguards, that, if we're going to do this, if the state is going to take responsibility for it, we need to make sure that people aren't cheating, that we take steps to deal with problem gambling and those kinds of things.
So where will that money go? Well, up to $500,000 to the Lottery Commission for administrative expenses, $2 million to the Department of Health and Human Services for gambling addiction and treatment programs, $1 million to the North Carolina Amateur Sports to expand opportunities for youth to engage in sports, including the purchase of equipment or facilities upgrades for youth sports. And $1 million goes for grants to be distributed by the North Carolina Outdoor Heritage Advisory Council, including for teams to travel to sporting events and to attract small-scale sporting events to the state.
$300,000 annually goes to the athletic departments at 13 public UNC system colleges and universities, everybody but North Carolina and NC State. The list grew over time, from schools with tiny athletic department budgets and historically black colleges and universities, all the way up to UNC Charlotte, App State, and ECU. The schools will receive 20% of all remaining money after the mandatory payments. Of the remaining money, 30% goes to the newly created North Carolina Major Events, Games, and Attractions Fund, and 50% goes to the General Fund. The Major Events Fund is to be used to attract events like All-Star Games and races, or even a Super Bowl to North Carolina.
Hang on, let's do the math here. That's $8.4 million designated to specific things. Then, of the tens of millions left, 50% will go to the general fund that lawmakers can decide how to allocate in each annual budget, 30% will go towards attracting big sporting events to the state, and 20% will be split among the athletic departments at those 13 public universities.
Yeah, you've got it. And this is where sports gambling has made such huge strides in the country. In December, more than $13 billion was wagered legally on sports in the United States. Since launching mobile sports betting in 2021 and limited in-person casinos after, Virginia has taken in more than $13.7 billion in sports bets. That's led to $144 million in taxes paid to the state. Virginia allows for operators to take deductions and has a slightly lower tax rate at 15%. In 2023 alone, Virginia took in $72 million in taxes. It sounds like a lot, and it is to most people, but North Carolina's state budget is more than $30 billion. $72 million? It's kind of a rounding error. And Cooper wants more of the funding for public education, as he laid out at the bill signing in Charlotte.
There has been, now, and will continue to be, a debate on how to invest the revenue that has been generated or that will be generated from this legislation. And there are some very good investments for this bill. But legislators, if you will allow my 30-second commercial, As we implement this legislation, I urge the legislature to focus more on investing funding in public education. Our teachers, our students, our public schools need us, not only with this revenue in this legislation, but across the funding stream of our state. Those investments need to be made now because public education is our future workforce.
Future legislatures are not obligated to keep the money breakdown that way. Current lawmakers cannot tie the hands of future lawmakers when it comes to how money is spent. So it's possible, really likely, that mix will change. Some opponents argued that the money allocated to treatment of gambling addiction is woefully inadequate to address the problems some in the state may face. Here's State Representative Marcia Morey.
They kind of tout what the revenue will be tax-wise, but the tax gains are minuscule to what people would be wagering and spending in the billions of dollars to enrich the gambling industry. And I think in the end, they're the only winners. Problem gambling is serious, and it really affects especially young men, ages 21 to 34. And of those who gamble, 12% of them become problem gamblers. We're not investing in the issue that we're going to be growing in problem gambling. That should be addressed. So, just getting down to the money, it's still a losing proposition. It's a winning proposition for DraftKings and the big industry, but it's a losing proposition for those who gamble.
Bettors who want to opt out can fill out self-exclusion forms with the Lottery Commission that all operators will have access to. So instead of registering with each operator individually, bettors can do it once. This is called self-exclusion. You can basically bar yourself from sports betting in North Carolina for 1, 3, 5 years, or even for life.
With the proliferation of mobile sports betting across the nation, academics and scientists have begun studying the consequences. On the brain, where gambling has some of the same impacts as alcohol or drug use, on young men, on college students, on early warning signs, on the math of gambling. Some of that research is happening right here in North Carolina.
My name is Michelle Malkin. I am an assistant professor of criminal justice and criminology, as well as the director of the Gambling Research and Policy Initiative at East Carolina University. The Gambling Research and Policy Initiative was established with an initial annual grant that will be provided to us by the Department of Health and Human Services here in North Carolina to ensure that we are keeping up with understanding gambling prevalence, behavior, risk, etc. here in the state of North Carolina, but also beyond, nationally and internationally, understanding where North Carolina falls. We are geared towards working on research that is looking at under-researched populations, including marginalized individuals and historically oppressed individuals, because there's just a lot less research understanding in terms of gambling among those populations. We also hope to be a pillar for the establishment of gambling treatment diversion courts around the United States.
With the legalization comes, not surprisingly, an increase in gambling. And that has impacts down the line, Malkin said.
When it comes to sports gambling, and especially the sports gambling apps, they're kind of created in a way that's really similar to slot machines. You can place a wager every couple seconds for different activities going on live in a game. And so it's kind of a constant ability to keep wagering without really the ability to think through how much you're wagering at any given time. When it comes to sports wagering, we tend to see a growth of young individuals engaged in gambling, especially at a much higher or riskier rate. And so what we tend to see with sports wagering initially is a large growth of calls going to the gambling helpline, not just by individuals seeking help, but by affected others, family members, etc., who see that somebody, a loved one, seems to be impacted by this new form of gambling. individuals, especially college students and emerging adults 18 to 24, seem to be at a higher risk for this form of gambling than what we've traditionally seen with other forms of gambling. So because you can wager on your own team and individuals are already kind of big fans of different teams, and it helps them feel like they're more part of the action if they're also wagering on it.
When the lottery was implemented, the amount it could spend on advertising was capped by law. There's no real way to cap what gambling operators can spend on advertising, which is their way to attract customers and separate themselves from others in the space. The commission did institute guidelines around gambling operator advertising, mostly aimed at keeping the ads away from audiences of young people.
I always want to emphasize that I do believe that legal and regulated gambling is better than illegal and unregulated gambling. And what we do know from research is whether it's legal or not, individuals are engaged in these behaviors in much more risky ways if it's not legal and regulated. And so it's not a bad thing that North Carolina and other places are expanding legalization in forms of gambling that people are already engaged in. It definitely protects the consumer or the individual engaged in it. But what we don't have, and what worries me a little bit, not only in North Carolina, but everywhere, but including North Carolina, is having the resources necessary right away to help those individuals who start to struggle with gambling-related harms and not know where to get the resources they need, as well as we haven't fully educated young individuals and even adults in terms of how to gamble in a healthy way, how to know how to incorporate it into one's budget, what is too much, what are the risks involved with different forms of gambling, different kinds of bets.
There have already been studies of gambling and gambling addiction in North Carolina, so those who are following the issue have a baseline.
Our last study showed that in North Carolina, regardless of if you live on the eastern side of the state or the western side of the state, we have a 5.5% problem gambling rate. This is really disturbing in the sense that we don't have a lot of legalized forms of gambling in the state.
The state has a problem gambling program and a helpline at 877-718-5543. We'll put that number in the show notes too, in case you need it.
After this final break, how the battle for sports betting in North Carolina will be remembered from people on both sides of the fight.
Brian, in all these interviews, you asked a similar question to everyone.
Yeah, I wanted to know what they thought we'd remember about this fight, this effort, this process, whatever you want to call it. We talked about the Dixie Classic, an event that hasn't been held in 60 plus years, and the vote to approve the lottery, which hasn't happened in about 2 decades.
Some of this stuff tends to stick around, and there's an evolution on a lot of these issues. Here's Bobby, a gambler in Raleigh.
I would say 20 years ago, I would say most folks who knew that if I would, because of how much I gambled, thought that it was shady. And then, as it's kind of evolved over time and you kind of started to get more and more, I guess we'll say the illegal offshore line stuff, it started to become more acceptable. And I would say now, it's one of those, I get phone calls at 11:30 on Sundays with people asking me my advice for bets and such like that. I have a good friend of mine who he's a sports writer up in Vermont, and he was asking me about it because he's kind of did a deep dive because they just legislated a bit there. And, I recommended that he go ahead and take the free bet and get used to it. And he sent me a screenshot of, the first 3-team parlay he lost by a point. And, he just started complaining. And I told him, welcome to sports gambling. So it's quite strange that now I'm the normal one. I have a lot of people calling me for advice that I haven't heard from in a while. I think in 5 years, placing a 3-teamer on a Sunday is going to be just the same as setting your fantasy football lineup.
We heard from Chess McDowell many times in this series. He's the lobbyist for several professional teams in the state and one of the major supporters of sports betting.
I think what we'll see is that sports betting is a really good thing for North Carolina. It's really good for the economic development. It increases the value of our teams. We're going to see the Panthers have just hired a new head coach. They're in a rebuilding season. The Hornets have new ownership. They're rebuilding. We're still recruiting, all these other things. We've never had a Super Bowl here. All those things that we're still pushing for, still recruiting. I think that it just increases the value of sports in North Carolina.
Here's State Rep Marcia Morey, a former U.S. Olympian and opponent of mobile sports betting.
Maybe we'll look back and think, well, we opened Pandora's box, or maybe it'll just be a given that this is part of our society now. But I think we are already seeing, stories of players getting in trouble. The NFL had a suspension of 5 players last year. There are 41 college athletes from 5 different schools investigated last year for engaging in gambling. So I think those stories will continue. I think people with addiction, those problems will become much more prevalent and a concern. And we will see these industries just reap the profits and some of the heartaches hitting the families.
This is State Representative Jason Sain, who led the push for legalization.
I think folks will see the benefits of the revenue, and, it'll be a big nothing burger 5 years from now.
State Senator Jim Perry, who led the effort in the Senate, echoes Jason Sain.
I don't think there'll be a conversation. I don't think it really matters. I think it's a blip on the radar in terms of, will it be a big part of a society or societal conversation 5 years from now? I don't think so.
Finally, here's Governor Roy Cooper, another supporter.
I don't have any concerns about its effect. I think we know that this is going to be popular and people are going to use it. I just want the mechanics of it to work right, and I think it will. I think it will. We have people here who've done this before, and who everybody wants it to happen yesterday, but they are making sure that the rules are in place and everybody understands the rules. And I think you've got all of the teams out there that have already begun thinking about how they're going to incorporate this as part of what they're doing. So I'm more excited about it than apprehensive.
And Tim, I'll ask you, in 5 years, what will we think about sports betting, if we think about it at all?
Well, personally, I hope I'm thinking it's a good value bet to put a future on the Panthers to win the Super Bowl or the Canes to win the Cup. But when we're actually thinking about sports betting and sports gambling kind of as a whole, I think it's going to feel really weird to be remembering a time when it wasn't available to us, right? It's like, my grandparents grew up without a TV. It'll be one of those kind of things that it's like it's around now and it's part of our lives.
I think in like the lottery, there's no push to get rid of the lottery. I don't think there'll be a push to get rid of sports gambling. I do worry about its impacts. I have a young son. I worry about growing up where the line is as important as who wins the game and what that does to young fans or even old fans. Do you worry more about your money over your cheering for your team and your fandom?
And that is something that sports, I think, could change a bunch. I host an afternoon show. How much is my conversation going to be about who won and how much is going to be about who covered? Those are slightly different conversations that are going to impact the way we talk about sports.
And there's a whole host of issues to work out. I mean, injuries suddenly take on a whole different meaning when you're talking about people betting on these games. I do wonder how long it's going to take for arenas around the state to suddenly be the FanDuel Dome or the, Caesar Sportsbook at Bank of America Stadium. I certainly think they're the ones with the money, and sports certainly needs the money to pay these salaries. How long until the melding becomes one and the same?
And how long until that isn't abnormal? Right? When those names are everywhere, it's going to become normal at some point in time.
Well, we appreciate you listening to this podcast and just kind of tracing that history. And I wonder if in 20 years, someone will be tracing the history of sports betting and seeing, exactly what has come from it.
And they'll be using a lot of your reporting as the basis for their reporting 20 years from now.
He's Tim Donnelly of 99.9 The Fan, and I'm Brian Murphy of WRAL News. Thank you for listening to this season of A Brief History of Triangle Sports.
A Brief History of Triangle Sports is a production of Capital Broadcasting Company. Brian Murphy's extensive reporting is the basis of this season, along with reporting from other journalists at WRAL News and coverage from 99.9 The Fan. Graham Hill is our studio producer. Each episode is mixed by Doug Miller. Anita Normanley is our executive producer. Thanks for listening.